The morning, my daughter-in-law laid my grandmother's embroidered tablecloth flat on the floor in front of the garage door and wiped her muddy boots across its face. She looked me straight in the eye and smiled. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. 63 years of living, and I can tell you without a trace of exaggeration that nothing, not the death of my mother, not the fire that took my first studio, not the years I spent eating plain rice and calling it dinner, nothing has ever hit me the way that smile did. It was not a careless smile. It was not the smile of someone who had made a mistake and didn't realize it. It was deliberate. It was curated. It was the smile of a woman who wanted me to know, in no uncertain terms, exactly what she thought of me. Her name is Renata Evelyn Marchetti Caldwell. And from the moment my son Marcus brought her home 4 years ago, she wore her contempt for me the way some women wear perfume, constantly, generously, and without apology. But I am getting ahead of myself. You need to understand where I came from before you can understand what she took from me and what I eventually took back. My name is Adele Fontaine Beaumont. I am 62 years old. I was born in a town called Covington, Louisiana, into a family that didn't have much but stitched everything it had together. Literally, my grandmother, Celestine Fontaine, was the finest hand embroiderer in a 3-parish radius. She could look at a field of wildflowers and reproduce their exact colors and textures on a piece of silk with nothing but a needle and thread, and the patience of someone who had made peace with time. My mother learned from her, and my mother taught me. I started embroidering when I was 5 years old. By the time I was 12, I could execute a satin stitch so smooth it looked poured rather than sewn. By 15, I had begun developing something that would define the rest of my life, a technique I would eventually call raised dimension threading, a method of building up layers of thread with such precision and architectural intent that the finished piece had a 3-dimensional quality, not just the suggestion of texture, but actual topography, mountains of silk, forests of cotton, flowers that seemed to bloom outward from the fabric as if reaching for light. I moved to Atlanta at 21 with $40 and a wooden sewing box that had belonged to Celestine. I cleaned office buildings at night and embroidered during the day, and I sold my first piece, a 14 by 18-inch panel of a magnolia tree in full bloom, for $35 at a craft fair on Peachtree Street. The woman who bought it cried. I remember thinking, this is the most powerful thing I have ever done. Not the cleaning, not the surviving, the making of something so beautiful it made a stranger weep. Over the next 2 decades, I built a small but steady reputation. I sold through galleries. I took commissions from interior designers, from brides, from collectors who had heard about my 3D technique through quiet word of mouth. I was never famous. I was never rich. But I had a studio in a little building on Moreland Avenue, a loyal clientele, and a life that felt like mine. Then Marcus's father died. Then the 2008 crash took the savings I had spent 20 years building. And then I made the decision that a woman of my age, my temperament, and my history should have known better than to make. I trusted my son. Marcus was 31 when he came to me with his plan. He was working in commercial real estate and had found what he called a perfect investment property in Buckhead, a mixed-use building he was certain would triple in value within 5 years. He needed a co-signer, he said. He needed someone the bank would take seriously. He looked at me with those eyes that still held traces of the little boy who used to fall asleep in my studio, surrounded by the smell of thread and beeswax, and I signed. I signed because I loved him. I signed because I believed in him. I signed because I was his mother, and that is what mothers do when they have been doing it alone since their husband died, and their child is the one bright, solid thing left in the world. The property never tripled. It barely broke even before Marcus sold it in a panic 2 years later to cover other debts I didn't know about. By the time everything settled, I had lost my studio. I had lost the building I'd worked out of for 17 years. I moved into the guest room of Marcus's house in Druid Hills, the lovely house in the lovely neighborhood that his new wife Renata had chosen and decorated and clearly regarded as a monument to herself. I came in quietly. I brought only what I could carry: my sewing boxes, my thread collections, my frames, my grandmother's tablecloth, and several dozen of my completed embroidery pieces that I had kept as personal archive, works I had never sold, works that documented the evolution of my technique over 40 years. I set up in the guest room. I was careful. I was grateful. I told myself it was temporary. What I did not know was that Renata had already decided what I was. She decided I was a charity case. She decided I was a nuisance. She decided that my boxes of thread and my careful, quiet hours of work were an eccentricity bordering on embarrassment, the hobby of an old woman who should have spent her time watching television and staying out of the way. She said things like, "Adele, are you still doing your little sewing project?" She said things like, "Marcus, your mother has fabric all over the guest bathroom again." She said it lightly. She said it with that smile. Always that smile. But the tablecloth was the moment everything changed. It was a Saturday morning in March. I had spread Celestine's tablecloth over the kitchen table to examine it. It needed a small repair. A few threads had loosened near one of the rose clusters, and I wanted to re-anchor them before they unraveled further. I had stepped away for perhaps 10 minutes to get my magnifying glass from the bedroom. When I came back, the tablecloth was gone from the kitchen table. I found it in front of the garage. Renata was coming back from her morning run. She had seen the tablecloth on the kitchen table and apparently decided, without asking, without pausing, without a single moment of consideration, that it made an adequate doormat. She had taken it, carried it to the front of the garage, and then placed it flat on the concrete. She was wiping her running shoes on a piece of embroidery that had taken my grandmother 3 years to complete. A piece that was, by any meaningful measure, irreplaceable, and she smiled at me. "Oh, this?" she said, following my gaze to the tablecloth. "It was just lying there. I figured it was a rag or something. The embroidery is cute, but honestly, it's pretty cheap looking, like something you'd find at a flea market." She shrugged. "I'll get it cleaned if you're upset." Cheap-looking, flea market. I stood there in the driveway in my house slippers and my reading glasses, and I felt something happen inside me that I don't have a precise word for. It was not just anger, though anger was certainly present. It was not just grief, though grief was folded into it. It was something older and more volcanic than either of those things. It was the accumulated weight of every time I had been made to feel small, every time my work had been dismissed, every time my silence had been mistaken for acceptance, every time I had swallowed something that deserved to be spoken. And in that moment, it rose up like lava through the cracks of a mountain that had been holding it for 62 years. I didn't say anything. I picked up the tablecloth. I carried it inside. I closed the door to the guest room, and I began to plan. You need to understand what that tablecloth meant before you can understand what happened next. Not just sentimentally, though God knows the sentiment was there, but technically, artistically, because what Renata wiped her shoes on was not merely a family heirloom. It was a masterwork, and her inability to recognize it was not simply ignorance. It was the specific, blinding ignorance of someone who had never once considered that value might exist outside the vocabulary she had been given to recognize it. Celestine Fontaine began that tablecloth in 1951. She finished it in 1954. It measured 68 inches by 48 inches and depicted an entire Louisiana bayou ecosystem. Cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, blue herons standing in still water, lily pads threaded with such microscopic precision that each pad had individual veining, water hyacinths in lavender and purple, rendered in the raised 3D technique that Celestine had invented herself and passed to my mother, and my mother had passed to me. In the bottom right corner, she had embroidered a small self-portrait, an old woman in a blue dress sitting at a table much like this one, sewing. The tablecloth had been appraised once in 1989 by a textile curator from the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, who had seen a photograph of it in a craft journal. He had come to my mother's house in Covington, examined it for 2 hours with a loupe, and told us it was, in his professional opinion, one of the finest examples of American folk embroidery he had ever encountered. He mentioned a figure. The figure was not small. My mother had thanked him politely and put it back on the table and continued using it for Sunday dinners because that was what it was for. Renata didn't know any of this. Renata had never asked. In 4 years of living under the same roof, first when I visited and then when I moved in, she had never once asked me about my work. She had never asked about Celestine. She had never asked where I learned, or how long I had been doing it, or what the technique involved, or why I spent hours each day bent over a frame with a needle thinner than a hair, and thread counted in individual strands. She had never asked because she had already decided the answer wasn't interesting. I thought about this as I sat in the guest room that Saturday afternoon, examining the tablecloth for damage. Miraculously, the concrete had not abraded it significantly. Renata's running shoes had been clean enough, and the contact time had been brief. There was a small scuff near one of the heron's legs, where grit had caught a raised thread, but it was repairable. I repaired it, slowly, methodically, the way I had repaired things my entire life. And as I worked, I thought about everything I had repaired that I should never have been required to repair. I thought about the year Marcus was 7, and his father went away for months at a time for work that I later understood was not entirely work, and I held everything together with double shifts at the hotel and late nights in the studio filling a commission for a woman in Virginia who wanted a large embroidered landscape for her foyer. And then I completed that piece working by lamplight after Marcus was asleep. and I mailed it on a Tuesday, and she called me on a Thursday to say it was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. And I sat down in the kitchen and cried for 20 minutes because no one had said anything kind to me in so long I had forgotten what it felt like. I thought about Marcus's father coming home for good and leaving again for good, and the divorce that nobody talked about like a divorce because we were too tired to name it properly. I thought about raising a son on my own in a city that had not yet decided whether people like me deserved to take up space. I thought about every school play I attended in paint-stained fingers, every parent-teacher conference where I was the only mother who came straight from work and smelled like thread and linseed oil. Every Christmas I assembled by strategic calculation and creative poverty while managing to make it feel like abundance. I thought about how Marcus had grown up knowing what I was, not just his mother, but an artist, a craftswoman, a person with a skill so particular it had taken a lifetime to develop, and how somewhere along the way, between the ambition of young adulthood and the acquisition of Renata and the house in Druid Hills, he had begun to see me through her eyes, as the woman with the sewing projects, as the guest, as the obligation. It made me ache in a place I hadn't known could still ache, but I did not let myself stay in that ache. There is a technique in embroidery called couching, where you lay a thick decorative thread on the surface of the fabric and then stitch it down with tiny, almost invisible anchoring threads. The thick thread doesn't go through the fabric. It stays on top. The anchoring stitches hold it. I have always thought of grief the same way. You don't push it through and hope it disappears. You lay it down carefully, and then you anchor it, and you work around it, and eventually it becomes part of the pattern. So I anchored the grief, and I picked up my needle, and I got back to work. Because here is the thing about embroidery that nobody tells you when they dismiss it as just sewing or a little hobby or something you pick up to pass the time. It requires more focused concentration than almost any other art form I have ever encountered. Not because it is intellectually complex, though the geometry of certain stitches can be genuinely mathematical, but because it requires you to be completely present. You cannot embroider while distracted. You cannot rush it. You cannot fake it. Every stitch is a commitment. Every stitch is visible. Every stitch, once placed, becomes part of something larger than itself. And the larger thing is only as good as the care that went into each individual mark. I had been practicing that presence for 57 years, and in the weeks after the tablecloth incident, I brought it to bear on a project I had been putting off for over a year. A large-scale piece I had begun designing in my head before I'd lost the studio. A full-size textile panel, 24 by 36 inches, depicting what I called an American garden in autumn. Dahlias and chrysanthemums and oak leaves and pumpkin vines, all rendered in my 3D raised technique, built up in layers until the flowers actually protruded from the surface of the fabric, until you could pass your hand across the finished piece and feel the individual petals. I worked in the guest room early mornings and late nights while the house was quiet. I did not tell Renata what I was doing. I did not tell Marcus. I spread a cloth over my work when I stepped out. I worked in silence, and I thought in silence, and I let the needle go in and out, in and out, in and out, building something from nothing, the way I had always built things from nothing. Let me tell you about the physics of what I do, because Renata never understood it. And most people don't. And the misunderstanding is at the root of every dismissal I have ever received from people who looked at embroidery and saw sewing the way someone might look at surgery and see cutting. The raised dimension threading technique begins with a base fabric. I prefer natural linen for structural work, a tight weave with a thread count high enough to anchor the layers that will come. On this base, I first establish what I call the skeleton, a series of foundational stitches, laid in precise geometric patterns that form the underlying architecture of the final image. These are not decorative stitches. They are structural. They will never be seen in the finished piece. They are the bones. On the skeleton, I then build the first tier of dimensional work, using a technique of padded satin stitch, multiple layers of thread stacked in carefully managed sequences, each layer anchored before the next is added, the tension calibrated so that the structure rises cleanly from the surface without puckering the base fabric. This alone takes extraordinary precision. The angle of the needle, the tension of the thread, the sequence of the layers, all of it must be executed with the kind of consistency that makes a machine feel plausible, but that no machine can replicate, because the variations of organic material, thread that shifts in humidity, silk that behaves differently at different temperatures, linen that responds to the warmth of working hands, require constant, in-the-moment adjustment that only a human who has spent decades learning the material can perform. Now, on the first tier, I build a second. On the second, depending on the image, sometimes a third. Each tier adds height and complexity, and the characteristic topography that makes my finished pieces what they are. A flower petal in one of my pieces has actual depth. It rises 3, sometimes 4 millimeters from the base surface in its center, tapering toward its edges with a curve that follows the anatomy of the real petal, its veining rendered in stitches so fine that a loop is required to see them clearly. All of this is done with a needle thinner than a darning needle and thread counted in individual strands, not by skeins, not by feet, but by the single filament, chosen for its specific optical properties, its color value in relation to the colors around it, its physical weight and how that weight will affect the structural behavior of the tier it is placed in. I have spent my entire adult life learning this. Every piece I make contains 40 years of failure and correction and refinement. Every piece I make is built on the ruins of pieces that didn't work, approaches that failed, techniques I tried and abandoned and tried again with modifications. The woman who put that tablecloth on the concrete thought she was stepping on a piece of old fabric. She was stepping on a century of accumulated knowledge, alive in every thread. I did not know then that the something I was building would become the axis on which my entire life would pivot. It happened because of a garbage bag. In April, about 6 weeks after the tablecloth incident, Renata decided to reorganize what she called the spare storage, a closet off the hallway that she had apparently decided was being used inefficiently. I was out that afternoon attending a small embroidery guild meeting that I had been invited to join by a woman named Dorothea, who had seen me working in a coffee shop and recognized the technique. When I came home, I found 3 of my archival embroidery pieces, mounted, framed, irreplaceable, leaning against the trash bins at the side of the house, not moved, not relocated, staged for garbage day. I stood on the driveway and looked at them. The autumn garden panel wasn't among them. It was still in the guest room, still in progress. But these 3 pieces, a large floral still life I had completed in 1997, a figurative piece from 2003 depicting a woman standing in a doorway, and a smaller botanical study from 2009 were among the finest work I had ever produced. The 1997 floral was, in my own estimation, the single most technically accomplished piece I had ever made. I had spent 8 months on it. It had been exhibited twice. I carried them inside. Renata was in the kitchen. "Those were going to the trash," she said, without looking up from her phone. "I know," I said. "They're taking up closet space. If you want to keep them, they need to go in your room." "My room," I repeated, "is also your closet, apparently." She looked up then. "Adele, I've been very patient. You have a lot of stuff for someone who is a guest in someone else's home." I said, "I am Marcus's mother." She said, "And this is Marcus's house, which I also live in." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I took my pieces upstairs. I want to tell you what I felt carrying those pieces up the stairs of that house, not what I thought. I have already told you what I thought, what I felt, because there is a difference, and the difference matters for the story I am telling you, which is a story about what happens when you let feeling and thinking work together, instead of having one drown out the other. I felt old, not in the tired sense or the defeated sense, but in the dimensional sense. The way a piece of embroidery is old when you look at it closely enough to see all the layers of work that went into it. I felt all 62 years of myself simultaneously, all the cells and aches and scars and satisfactions, all the times I had carried something up a flight of stairs that was heavier than it should have been, all the times I had stood in a doorway with my arms full, and no one to open it for me, all the times the dignity of what I was doing was invisible to the people I was doing it among. But I also felt, and this is the part that surprised me genuinely in the way that very few things surprise me anymore. I felt clear. The clarity was like the moment in early morning, just before full light, when the world seems to be holding its breath before it becomes itself. I stood at the top of the stairs with 3 embroideries under my arm, and I thought, this cannot continue. Not with anger, not with drama, just as a fact. The way you might observe that a door is not closing properly and decide that it needs rehanging. This cannot continue, and I am going to make sure it stops. That night, unable to sleep, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the 3 rescued pieces leaning against the wall. I looked at the autumn garden panel on its frame, nearly half finished now, the dahlias already rising from the surface in their impossible specificity. And I thought about what Dorothea had said at the guild meeting that afternoon, something she had mentioned almost as an aside, a piece of industry gossip she'd picked up from a friend who worked in textile arts in New York. She had said, "Have you heard about the search Maison Verlaine is doing on the French house? They're doing their first American-based capsule collection, and they want to incorporate authentic American textile art, handwork specifically. Someone told me they've been looking for months and haven't found what they want." Maison Verlaine. I knew the name. Everyone in my world knew the name. Though most of us operated so far from its atmosphere, it might as well have been a different planet. It was a French luxury fashion house founded in Lyon in 1923, known for extraordinary textile craftsmanship, known for the kind of garments that cost more than most people's cars and aged into heirlooms. They had been expanding into American markets for several years, and the rumor, which Dorothea delivered as verified fact, was that their current creative director, a Belgian woman named Isabelle Claes, who had spent years documenting traditional textile techniques across North America, was specifically looking for a handwork artist whose technique was genuinely distinctive, not decorative, not charming, technically extraordinary. I had not thought about submission. I had not thought about recognition of that kind in years. The studio loss had gutted my confidence more than I had admitted to anyone, including myself. I had told myself I was still making work for the work's sake, and that was true. But it was also true that I had stopped believing the work would ever find the larger world it deserved. I sat with Dorothea's words for 3 days. Then I photographed the 1997 floral piece. I photographed the figurative piece and the botanical study. I photographed the autumn garden panel in progress, or in the particular oblique light that best captured its topography, the way the silk petals caught the lamp glow and threw tiny shadows across each other. And then, on a Thursday night, while the house was quiet, and Renata was watching something on the television downstairs and Marcus was on a work call in his office, I found the email address for the Textile Acquisitions Department at Maison Verlaine through their website, and I wrote them a letter. I wrote it the way I embroidered, carefully, deliberately, with absolute attention to every choice. I introduced myself. I described my technique, the raised dimension threading, the architectural approach to surface, the method of building layers that I had developed over decades of observation and practice. I told them about Celestine. I told them about the 40 years, and I attached the photographs. I did not mention the guest room. I did not mention the garbage bins. I did not mention Renata's smile. I pressed send, and I sat in the dark guest room, and I did not expect much. What happened next took 2 weeks. First came a brief, professional acknowledgement from someone in acquisitions saying my inquiry had been received. Then 9 days later came an email from a different name, a personal assistant to Isabelle Claes herself, asking if I would be available for a video call the following Tuesday. I stared at that email for a long time. Then I closed my laptop, picked up my needle, and went back to work on the autumn garden. The call lasted 47 minutes. Isabelle Claes was a small, precise Belgian woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair, and the focused attention of someone who had been trained to see things others missed. She asked me to hold pieces up to the camera. She asked about thread count, about fiber composition, about the structural technique behind the dimensional layering. She asked questions that told me she already understood the vocabulary, that she was not looking to be charmed, but to be convinced. She asked how many pieces I had available. She asked whether I would consider an exclusive consultation arrangement. I answered all of her questions. I kept my voice even. I held the autumn garden panel up to the camera and watched her eyes change. "This technique," she said, "is extraordinary. It's unlike anything I've seen from American artists. And this dimensional structure, you developed this independently?" "I developed it from a foundation my grandmother laid," I said. She discovered the basic principle. I spent 40 years refining and extending it. Your grandmother, she leaned closer to her screen, is her work documented anywhere? I thought about the tablecloth. Her most significant piece is in my possession, I said. There was a pause. Then Isabeau said, Mrs. Beaumont, I would like to fly you to New York. I went back downstairs after the call. Renata was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine, still in the clothes she'd worn to the gym. She glanced at me. You look weird, she said. I had a phone call, I said. With who? I looked at her. I thought about the tablecloth on the concrete. I thought about the frames against the garbage bins. I thought about the word cheap. With someone who wanted to talk about my embroidery, I said. She nodded with that particular brand of disinterest she deployed whenever my world was mentioned. Cool, she said, and looked back at her wine. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I allowed myself for exactly 5 minutes to feel the full, enormous irony of the universe. Then I picked up my needle, and I added 6 more petals to the largest dahlia in the autumn garden. I flew to New York on a Tuesday in May. Marcus drove me to the airport. He was quiet in the car in the particular way he had been quiet with me for the past 2 years. Not hostile, not cold exactly, but careful, managed. Like a man who was afraid that any deviation from the careful management of his wife and his mother might cause both structures to collapse simultaneously. You look nice, he said at the departures curb. Thank you, Marcus. What's the meeting about exactly? A potential collaboration, I said. I'll tell you more when I know more. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, something that had been waiting in him for a long time. But instead, he put my bag on the curb and hugged me and got back in the car. I took my embroideries to New York in a flat portfolio case that I had bought at an art supply store on my way to the airport. I took the autumn garden panel, now 90% complete. I took the 1997 floral and the 2003 figurative piece. And I took Celestine's tablecloth, carefully folded between sheets of acid-free tissue in its own dedicated case. The Maison Verlaine office occupied the top 3 floors of a limestone building on West 57th Street. The elevator opened into a reception area that smelled of something I couldn't immediately identify, some combination of leather and cedar wood, and the particular clean sharpness of very expensive fabric. The walls were hung with framed textile samples I recognized as historical. A section of jacquard weaving, a fragment of hand-painted silk, a piece of cutwork embroidery that might have been 17th century Venetian. A young woman in a perfectly cut black dress led me through a hallway and into a large, well-lit studio space that looked less like an office and more like a workshop. Long tables covered in fabric samples, a row of dress forms along one wall, task lighting at every station. Isabeau Claus was waiting. She stood when I came in. She was smaller than she'd seemed on the screen, barely 5'2", but she had the quality I had noticed in the video call, that quality of complete, undistracted attention, as if the room narrowed to wherever she was looking. There were 2 other people in the room, a man I was introduced to as Theodore, the house's head of textile development, and a woman named Pilar, who was apparently the creative director's personal archivist. Mrs. Beaumont, Isabeau said, shaking my hand with both of hers, Thank you for coming. Please, show me everything. I showed her everything. I laid the pieces out on the long table, one by one, and I talked about each one, when it was made, what it documented technically, what problem I had been solving, or what question I had been exploring when I made it. I talked about the raised dimension threading, the specific sequence of layering, the way tension was managed through the base fabric, the method of anchoring each elevated tier so that the structure remained stable and the surface remained perfectly smooth between protrusions. Theodore listened with his head slightly bowed, the way people listen when they are genuinely learning. Pilar took photographs throughout. When I unfolded Celestine's tablecloth, the room went quiet. Isabeau approached it slowly, the way you approach something that might be real or might not be. She bent over it with a loop that appeared from her pocket. She traced the raised surface of the lily pads without touching, just her finger hovering a centimeter above the surface following the topography. She moved to the water hyacinths. She moved to Celestine's self-portrait in the corner. When was this made? She asked, not looking up. Between 1951 and 1954, I said, by my grandmother, Celestine Fontaine, in Covington, Louisiana. Isabeau straightened. She looked at me over the loop. This dimensional technique is in a direct line with your current work. It's where the current work came from, I said. She looked back at the tablecloth. This should be in a museum, Mrs. Beaumont. I know, I said. I've always known. There was a pause. Then she said, what would it take for you to enter into a formal creative partnership with Maison Verlaine? I had prepared for this. I had spent 2 weeks preparing for this quietly, without telling anyone, the way I prepared for everything that mattered, carefully, methodically, with absolutely no wasted motion. I want to be compensated at the rate of a senior creative consultant, I said. I want formal attribution, not a footnote, not an acknowledgement, but public prominent credit on every piece that incorporates my technique or any derivative of it. I want ownership of my original pieces to remain with me unless we agree to an explicit purchase. I want a clause in any agreement that specifies exclusivity in the American handwork category, meaning Maison Verlaine will not use another American 3D embroidery artist for any competing line as long as we are under agreement. And I want to be consulted on how my technique is taught to any House Atelier members who learn it. The room was very quiet. Isabeau looked at Theodore. Theodore looked at Isabeau. Then Isabeau looked at me with something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one, the expression of someone who had just encountered a level of seriousness they had not fully anticipated and found they approved of it. We can work with that, she said. The contract took 3 weeks to finalize. I had a lawyer, a woman named Constance, who had been one of my embroidery clients back in the studio days, and who now owed me in ways she had acknowledged were not payable in embroidery alone. Review it line by line. I made 2 modifications and signed on a Thursday afternoon in my room in Druid Hills, while Renata was at a spin class and Marcus was at work. I told no one until everything was executed. The announcement came from Maison Verlaine's communications team in the form of a press release timed to coincide with their fall collection preview. It described the new capsule line, a series of garments and household textiles incorporating what they called a uniquely American, three-dimensional hand embroidery technique developed over 4 decades by Atlanta-based textile artist Adele Fontaine-Beaumont. It described the technique in terms I recognized as Isabeau's own language: architectural, unprecedented, a bridge between American folk tradition and high European craftsmanship. It included a photograph of the autumn garden panel, now complete. It included a photograph of Celestine's tablecloth. The press release was picked up by 5 publications within 48 hours. Marcus saw it on his phone at breakfast. He looked up at me across the kitchen table with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was 12 years old, open-mouthed, unguarded, stripped of the management. "Mom," he said. "Good morning," I said, and poured my coffee. Renata came in then, saw Marcus's face, took his phone, read the release. She read it twice. I watched her face do something complicated, something that moved through disbelief and recalibration and landed in a place I might have called panic if I had believed she was capable of the kind of self-assessment that would generate genuine panic. She put the phone down. "This is you," she said. "Yes," I said. "Maison Verlaine," she said. "The fashion house." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then, with a facility for social recalibration that I genuinely had to admire, she rearranged her face into something warm. "Adele, that's incredible. I always knew your work was special." She reached across the table and touched my hand. "You should have told us. I would have." I looked at her hand on mine. I thought about the tablecloth on the concrete. I thought about the frames against the garbage bins. I thought about cheap. "Renata," I said very quietly, "do you remember what you said about my grandmother's embroidery?" Her hand went still. "You said it looked cheap," I said, "like something from a flea market. Do you remember that?" The kitchen was very quiet. She started. "I know," I said. "You were just telling me what you thought." I picked up my coffee. "I'm moving out at the end of the month. I've found an apartment near Ponce de Leon. I'll be closer to my new studio." "Your new studio," she repeated. "Maison Verlaine is providing a studio space," I said. "They want me based in Atlanta, close to the atelier they're opening here." "An atelier," Marcus said, still in that open, undone voice. "Yes." I stood up. "Marcus, I'd like to take you to lunch before I move out. Just us. I have some things I want to say to you." He nodded. Renata said nothing. I put my cup in the sink and went upstairs to pack. The launch event for the capsule collection was held in October at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, a choice that Isabeau had made specifically because of its textile collection, and because of the history I had mentioned with the curator who had appraised Celestine's tablecloth. The tablecloth itself was included in the exhibition as the centerpiece of a retrospective component that traced the lineage of the raised dimension threading technique from Celestine's 1950s origins through my 4 decades of refinement. It was the single most attended private event in the museum's recent history. I wore a dress commissioned for me by Maison Verlaine, a deep burgundy silk gown with 3-dimensional floral embroidery along the collar and cuffs, executed in the style of my technique by atelier members I had personally trained. I stood with Isabeau for photographs. I spoke briefly about Celestine, about Louisiana, about what the needle means when it becomes a lifetime's language. When they asked me to name the people who had influenced my work, I listed Celestine. I listed my mother. I listed every woman I had learned from and beside, through craft fairs and guild meetings, and the long, quiet hours of parallel solitude that bind all makers together across time and geography. I did not mention my son's house. I did not mention the guest room. I did not mention the garbage bins or the concrete of the driveway. There was a guest list, as there always is for these events. It was curated by the Maison Verlaine team. 240 names, a combination of press, collectors, cultural figures, and personal guests of the featured artists. Renata Evelyn Marchetti Caldwell was not on it. She had sent Marcus with a message. Would there be a +1 consideration? She was so proud of her mother-in-law. She had always believed in Adele's talent. She had been one of her earliest supporters. I had received the message through Marcus. I had held it in my hands for a long moment, standing in the new studio, surrounded by the smell of thread and the amber light of October through tall windows. Then I had handed it back. No, I said. Marcus started to say something. Then he didn't. She is welcome to visit the public portion of the exhibition during regular museum hours, I said, but the event is not for her. He nodded. He looked tired. He looked like a man who was finally understanding the cost of a long string of choices that had seemed, each individually, like small concessions. I put my hand on his arm. Lunch, I said. Still you and me, I haven't forgotten. I'm not going anywhere. He nodded again, and this time something in his face shifted back toward the boy who used to fall asleep in my studio. My studio on Ponce de Leon Avenue smells like thread and beeswax and old wood and strong coffee, and I want you to know that I am aware every single morning when I push open that door and step into the light that this smell is the smell of everything I have survived to arrive at. It is 9 months since the launch. I have completed 3 commission pieces for the Maison Verlaine Spring Collection. I have trained 7 atelier members in the foundational principles of raised dimension threading. Not the full technique, which remains mine, but enough to understand and support the structural approach. I am working on a new personal piece, a large-scale rendering of the Louisiana Bayou that Celestine depicted in the tablecloth. From my memory of her memory of it, my version of the world she made and gave to me. Celestine's tablecloth is currently on loan to the High Museum. They are discussing acquisition. I have not decided yet. Some things are not for sale at any price, and some things belong in the world where they can teach. I am thinking about which this is. I have my own apartment now, a 2-bedroom on the 4th floor with a balcony, where I put a chair and a small table and sometimes sit in the early morning with my coffee before the city wakes up. I bought the furniture myself. I hung my own work on the walls, on the kitchen table, on a frame I made from reclaimed wood. I have placed a piece of embroidery that I am doing just for myself, a self-portrait in the bottom right corner of a large composition, in the way that Celestine placed herself in the tablecloth. An old woman in a chair sewing, watching everything. Marcus and I have had our lunch. We have had several lunches now. We talk about things that are real. He told me, over eggs at a place near Piedmont Park, that he had not fully understood what he had done when he asked me to co-sign that loan, or rather, that he had understood but had allowed himself not to understand, which is its own kind of cowardice that he is now doing the uncomfortable work of examining. I listened. I did not rush to reassure him. I let the discomfort be present because it was his discomfort to sit in, not mine to dissolve. I told him about Celestine. I told him things about her I had never told him before. Stories my mother had told me and her mother had told her. The long chain of women passing thread and memory forward through the hands. He cried a little, which surprised him. I was not surprised. I had always known he had more of Celestine in him than he knew. We are rebuilding. It is slow and it is real, and it is worth the slowness. Renata and Marcus's marriage, I have been told by mutual parties, is under significant strain. I did not cause this. I want to be clear about that. I did not do anything to cause or accelerate whatever is happening between them, because that was never my goal and has never been my interest. My interest was and remains only my own life. What happens in that house on that hill is between them and whatever reckoning they are navigating, and I pray for them both. I do. The way you pray for people who have hurt you when you have finally put enough distance between the hurt and your own center of gravity to distinguish between wishing them ill and hoping for their growth. I do not wish Renata ill. I wish her the experience of encountering something so beautiful. It shakes loose her assumptions about what has value and what does not. I wish her a moment like the one Isabeau Kloss had in that studio on West 57th Street, bent over the surface of a tablecloth made by an old woman in Louisiana who had nothing and made everything. I wish her the education of that moment. Whether she gets it is her business. There have been 4 fashion shows since the partnership began. I have attended all of them. I have stood in the wings and watched models walk in garments that carry the trace of my grandmother's hands, the refinement of my own 40 years, the specific intelligence of the raised dimension threading, made legible at scale in a way it has never been legible before. I have felt in those moments something I do not have a better word for than rightness. The rightness of a thing being seen for what it is. The rightness of value recognized. Renata has not attended any of them. The guest list remains curated. I have been asked by the Maison Verlaine events team whether I have anyone I would like to add. Each time I have thought about the question carefully. Each time I have said, not at this time. This is not revenge. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters in embroidery and in life. Revenge would have been making sure she knew, making sure she suffered, making sure the humiliation was administered in proportion to the humiliation received. That is not what this is. What this is the simple exercise of a right I have earned. The right to choose who enters the spaces I have built. The right to say, without explanation, that this is mine, and who stands in it is my decision. Renata called me once, about 2 months after the launch, at 7 a.m. while I was sitting on my balcony with my coffee. She said she had been reflecting. She said she realized she had not been fair to me. She said she hoped we could move past the misunderstandings. I listened to the whole thing. Then I said, "Thank you for calling, Renata." And I ended the call. She expected more. I could hear it in the silence before the call disconnected. That expectation of further exchange, of the opportunity to be forgiven, to be welcomed back, to have the ledger balanced in her favor. But a conversation requires 2 people to agree on what is being repaired And what I have determined is that there is nothing between Renata and me that needs repairing. And there was never a relationship there to damage. There was only her contempt and my silence, and the silence is over now. I am not silent anymore, not about my work, not about my worth, not about what I have built or what it means or what it cost. I think about Celestine often. I think about the years she spent in Covington, Louisiana, in a time when the world was organized in ways designed specifically to ensure that a woman like her would never be seen, would never be recognized, would never accumulate the kind of authority that her skill merited. I think about her bending over the tablecloth for 3 years, building a bayou from thread, making something extraordinary in a context that offered her no framework for understanding her own extraordinariness. I think about her self-portrait in the corner, the old woman in the blue dress, sewing, watching. She put herself in the work because she knew the work would outlast everything else. She knew that the tablecloth would still be there when the world that had dismissed her was gone. She didn't need anyone to recognize the tablecloth. She knew what it was. I am 62 years old. I have been making things with my hands for 57 years. I have been dismissed and overlooked and reduced to a guest in my own son's house, and had my grandmother's masterwork wiped with muddy shoes. I have also trained ateliers and signed contracts and stood in museums and watched strangers weep over things I made in the dark, in the quiet, after everyone else went to sleep. I have learned this. The needle does not ask permission. You push it through, and it goes through. And on the other side, the thread comes out exactly where you aimed it. And if you are precise, and if you are patient, and if you have spent 57 years learning the anatomy of what you love, the picture that emerges is exactly the picture you intended. I intend to keep making pictures. The balcony faces east. In the mornings, before the city finds its volume, I sit there in my chair, and I hold my coffee in both hands, and I look at the light coming up over the rooftops, and I think about Celestine's bayou, and about the piece I am building of it, and about all the pieces still ahead of me that I haven't imagined yet, but that are out there waiting in the unmarked fabric of whatever comes next. My kindness was never a doormat, and neither, as it turns out, was my grandmother's tablecloth. The embroidery continues. People ask me sometimes at events, at the guild meetings I still attend because the women there are my people and always have been. They ask me whether I feel vindicated, whether the partnership with Maison Verlaine, the museum exhibition, the public recognition, has given me the satisfaction of being proven right. They expect me to say yes. They expect a triumphal note, a closing flourish, something that arrives like the final chord of a song that has been building toward resolution for a long time. The honest answer is more complicated than yes. I feel vindicated in a narrow technical sense. The work was always what I knew it was. The raised dimension threading was always what I knew it was. Celestine's tablecloth was always what the High Museum curator told us it was back in 1989. None of those things needed Maison Verlaine to confirm them. They were true before Isabeau Claus flew me to New York, and they would have remained true if she hadn't. The validation of external recognition is real, but it is secondary. It always has been. What I feel more than vindicated is clarified. The experience of the last 4 years, the loss of the studio, the guest room, Renata's contempt, the decision to contact Maison Verlaine, the call, New York, the contract, the launch. All of it has clarified something in me that had been building for decades, but that I had never quite articulated fully enough to live by completely. Here is what it is. Other people's inability to see the value of a thing does not diminish the value of the thing. It diminishes only their own capacity for sight. This sounds simple. And it sounds like the kind of thing you put on a motivational card and forget immediately. But I am telling you that internalizing it, truly digesting it, building it into the architecture of your daily choices, is one of the hardest things I have ever done. Because we are social creatures. We need each other's recognition in ways that are not weaknesses, but necessary facts of being human. The challenge is not to stop needing recognition, but to stop confusing the absence of recognition with the absence of worth. Celestine never confused them. I spent most of my adult life half confusing them. The years of the guest room clarified me into someone who no longer does. I think about the women who taught me, not just Celestine and my mother, but the others. The women at guild meetings and church basements across Louisiana, and then Georgia. The older women who brought their frames and their boxes and their decades of knowledge into circles of folding chairs and shared it freely, without credential, without formality, with nothing but the absolute confidence of people who knew what they knew and did not require external confirmation of that knowledge. There was a woman named Estelle who showed me, when I was about 25 and still fumbling with the dimensional layering, how to read the tension in a fabric the way a doctor reads a pulse, by feel, by pressure, by the particular resistance that tells you something you need to know. Estelle was in her 70s by then and had never sold a piece in her life. She gave most of them away to people she loved. And she told me once that she didn't need anyone to buy what she made because making it was already the whole of what she needed. I thought at the time that this was either very wise or very sad, and now I understand it was only wise. There was a woman named Harriet who had started embroidering at 63, my age now, after her husband died, and left her alone in a house in Macon, with nothing but time and a box of things her daughters had been too busy to take. She learned fast, with the focused urgency of someone who understood that time is a fixed resource, and treating it as infinite is a form of arrogance. Within 5 years, she was producing work that made the rest of us put our needles down and stare. She died at 78, still working. Her family sold most of her pieces at an estate sale for almost nothing. I bought 3 of them. They are in my studio now, on the wall above the window where the light comes in each morning, and I look at them every day and think, this is what it looks like when you work without waiting for permission. This is the education I am carrying forward, not just the technical knowledge, the stitch vocabularies, the layering sequences, the fiber science and the color theory, and the structural engineering of raised textile art. But this deeper, subtler knowledge that what you make in the quiet and the dark, in the guest room after everyone else goes to sleep, is as real and as valid and as worthy of your full, passionate attention as anything that has ever been displayed in a museum or purchased by a fashion house or printed in the glossy pages of a magazine. The making comes first. The recognition, if it comes, is secondary. The recognition is not the point. The point is the needle going through. I have been thinking lately about teaching in a more formal sense. not the atelier work for Maison Verlaine. That continues, and it is gratifying in its own way to watch technically skilled young people encounter the raised dimension threading for the first time and feel their understanding of what is possible expand. But I mean something different. I have been in conversation with a community arts organization in Southside Atlanta about a residency, a sustained year-long program working with women from the neighborhood, women of all ages, women who have never embroidered and may never have thought of themselves as artists. The Maison Verlaine partnership has resources. I have proposed a budget. The conversation is progressing. I think about what Celestine would have made of all this. I think about her in Covington, Louisiana in 1952, bending over the tablecloth by lamplight, building a bayou from silk and cotton thread. I think about what she might have done if she had had the resources, the platform, the access to a wider world. I think this not with bitterness, but with a kind of structural grief. The grief for things that should have been possible and weren't, not because of anything Celestine lacked, but because of everything the world arranged to withhold from her. I cannot give that back to Celestine, but I can build something in her name that makes the world slightly less withholding for women who come after. I can bring the needle into spaces that have never had it. I can sit across from women who have been told, in 1,000 explicit and implicit ways, that what they make has no value, and I can tell them, not with words, but with thread, not with speeches, but with time, that this is a lie. That is the plan. That is what all of this was for. The autumn garden panel is now permanently installed in the Maison Verlaine Atlanta Atelier, a large light-filled room on Peachtree Street, where the workers can see it while they work. Isabeau insisted on this. She said it should be a living reference, something that the people in the room can look at and understand what they are working toward and working within. I agreed. There is something right about artwork being in a working space rather than behind a rope. Art made from labor belongs near labor. It knows its own kin. Celestine's tablecloth comes home at the end of its loan period next spring, and I have not yet decided its permanent location. I am considering donating it to the High Museum, with certain conditions attached. Conditions about display, about attribution, about the story that accompanies it, which must include Celestine's name and Celestine's life and the particular conditions of her genius, which was not incidental to where she was born, and when and to whom, but was made partly from those conditions, from the specific pressure of that specific time and place, the way diamonds are made from pressure, the way everything extraordinary is made from what the world puts against it. I am having the conversation with the museum's textile curator, a young woman named Dr. Amara Osei-Bonsu, who has the same quality Isabeau has of listening with her whole body. We are building an understanding together. It will be right, whatever we decide. There are some things I want to say directly before I close this account to whoever is reading it. Not philosophical things. I have said enough of those. Practical things. Earned things. If you have a skill that the people around you cannot see, keep developing it anyway. Do not pace your growth to their ability to recognize it. Growth precedes recognition. Recognition is always behind, always catching up, always arriving after the work has already moved further on. Do not slow down for it. If someone tells you what you make is cheap or small or flea market quality or the wrong kind of thing for serious attention, ask yourself whether they have ever built anything. Ask yourself whether they have ever bent over a needle in the small hours, adding stitch to stitch to stitch, accumulating a millimeter of beauty at a time over months and years. Whether they know what it costs to make something that didn't exist before and will exist after you are gone. If they have not done this, if they have only consumed and judged and assessed from the comfort of never having made anything at all, then their opinion is an opinion about their own limitations, and you can set it down without carrying it further. If you have been displaced from your own life, from the studio you built, from the space you made, from the position that was yours, do not equate displacement with defeat. Displacement is a location. Defeat is a conclusion. The first can be reversed. The second requires your consent. I did not consent. If you have children, tell them what you do, not the edited version, not the modest disclaimer, not the little hobby framing designed to make them comfortable or to protect yourself from the vulnerability of being seen. Tell them what it means. Tell them about Celestine. Tell them about the women in the circle of folding chairs. Tell them about the 40 years, what they cost and what they built and why the cost was worth it. Tell them before they bring home someone who will wipe muddy shoes on what you made. Because the one thing I would do differently, the one thing, is that I would have told Marcus the full story earlier, while he was still young enough to let it change who he was becoming. He knows it now. That is something. It is enough. I sat on the balcony this morning with my coffee as the sun came over the rooftops, and I thought about Celestine placing herself in the corner of the tablecloth, the old woman in the blue dress watching. I have been placing myself in the corner of my own work for 40 years, in the signature I developed as a young woman, a small stylized thread needle, almost invisible unless you know to look for it, woven into the lower right corner of every finished piece. It is mine. It has always been mine. Now the whole world is beginning to know to look for it, and I am still here, still bending over the frame, still pushing the needle through. The light on the balcony this morning was the color of raw silk, that particular pale gold that hasn't quite committed to yellow, that hangs in the air the way certain kinds of beauty hang in the air, asking you to stop and pay attention. I stopped. I paid attention. I held my coffee in both hands and I breathed it in. Then I went inside and picked up my needle, and the embroidery continued.